When he walked in on me in the bathroom, I froze, not from modesty or panic, but from something deeper. Something unnameable. I remember the sound of the door handle turning, the slow creak as it opened, and how the steam swirled between us like a curtain that didn't quite close in time. His eyes widened in shock, and mine. I couldn't tell you where I was looking, because in that moment, I wasn't anywhere. Just suspended, between guilt and curiosity. He stumbled back, apologizing, flustered. The door slammed shut. And I stood there, wet, vulnerable, not just in skin but in something I hadn't allowed to breathe in years. I remember gripping the towel tighter, as if I could wrap myself back into my role. Mother. Wife. Safe. But his face, his reaction, stayed in my mind. Not because it was inappropriate. But because something inside me sparked. Not lust. Not desire. But the terrifying sense that I had just crossed an invisible line, one I didn't even know was there. 3 weeks ago, I would have laughed off something like this. But now, I can't stop thinking about it. What it awoke. What it meant. And before you judge me, please, let me tell you everything. What really happened. The truth behind what started in that bathroom, and how it all led to something I still can't quite forgive myself for. And while you're listening, leave a comment with where you're watching from, and tell me, have you ever had a moment so small, so accidental, yet it changed absolutely everything? My mornings were always quiet. Not peaceful, just quiet. The kind of silence that settles not because everything is calm, but because everything has stopped trying. I used to fill the space with background noises, radio, television, even a podcast I didn't care about, just to avoid the weight of being alone with myself. But that day, I didn't even bother. I just sat at the kitchen table with a half-eaten slice of toast and lukewarm tea, watching the sun crawl across the linoleum floor. He was in the living room, headphones on, legs folded up like a child's, though he was no child anymore. His presence in the house was never intended to be permanent. Just a temporary arrangement while he figured things out, housing, classes, work. My husband had suggested it offhandedly, like it was no big deal. It's only for a few weeks, he'd said, you two will be fine. As if I was incapable of holding boundaries. As if I didn't already feel like a stranger in my own home. My husband had left the day before on another business trip. The 5th one this season. It used to bother me. Now it just dulled me. His schedule had become so predictable that I no longer asked where he was going. We spoke less and less. Mostly logistics. Bills. Groceries. A reminder to pick up dry cleaning. Sometimes I stared at the phone, daring it to ring with something other than obligation. The boy, my stepson, had been polite, distant, and quiet since he moved in. We didn't speak much. I made sure he had what he needed, and he stayed out of the way. But that morning, something was different. Maybe it was just me. I looked down at my hands. Wrinkled. Dry from the cleaning products I still used obsessively. I thought of all the ways I'd changed in the past 10 years, all the things I'd lost. Not just youth, something else. Spark. I could still be attractive, I knew that. But no one had looked at me like a woman in a long time. I was seen, yes. As someone's wife. Someone's stepmother. Someone's placeholder. I decided to take a shower, more out of routine than anything. The hot water felt good, almost like warmth from another human being. The steam fogged up the mirror, and for a few minutes, I felt like I could disappear. That's when it happened. I didn't hear the knock. Or maybe there wasn't one. The door opened suddenly, and he was standing there. His expression, wide-eyed, stunned, almost panicked, told me he hadn't expected anyone inside. My hands flew to the towel, my voice caught somewhere in my throat. Neither of us spoke. The steam between us thickened, but not enough to hide the look on his face. The way he stared, just for a moment, then turned and bolted out with a mumbled apology. I stood there for a long time after. The water ran cold before I even realized I hadn't moved. My heart was pounding, not from fear or shame, but from something I couldn't name. A pulse that didn't belong to embarrassment. Something else had shifted. The rest of the day passed in silence. He stayed in his room. I stayed in mine. Every time I heard the creak of the floorboards outside, I tensed. I avoided eye contact during dinner. Neither of us brought it up, though I could feel the tension hang between us like a wire pulled tight. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling fan, listening to it click like a broken metronome. My husband had texted earlier, landed. Meetings all day tomorrow. I hadn't replied. I tried to dismiss the incident as meaningless. A misunderstanding. A moment of discomfort that would fade. But the truth is, it didn't fade. It lingered. It grew. I kept thinking about his face. Not the shock, but what came after. That brief moment before he turned away. There had been something in his eyes that I couldn't ignore. Not lust. Not intention. Just curiosity. A rawness. And in some twisted way, it mirrored my own. The next morning, we moved around the kitchen like ghosts. He poured cereal. I made coffee. Our shoulders nearly touched as we reached for the sugar at the same time. He mumbled an apology and stepped back. I said nothing. But I felt the flush rise in my cheeks. What disturbed me more than anything was that I didn't want to forget it. I wanted to rewind it. To replay it from his point of view. Did he see me as just a woman in a towel? Or something else? Later that afternoon, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. I stood there for a long time, studying my posture, the curve of my waist, the loose strands of hair that always fell no matter how tight the bun. I adjusted the neckline of my blouse, just slightly, and stared into my own eyes. I didn't recognize the woman looking back. Not because she looked older, but because for the first time in years, she looked awake. I wish I could tell you that I nipped it all in the bud. That I went to my husband, confessed my thoughts, asked for something to change. But I didn't. I went back into the kitchen, made dinner, called him down like usual. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about the way his eyes had widened. The way mine had stopped blinking. And I realized I had stepped across a threshold that day, not physically, but emotionally. A boundary had been breached. And though no one touched anyone, something irreversible had happened. This wasn't just about a towel or a door left unlocked. It was about me. About something I hadn't felt in years, awakening in a moment of vulnerability. And the scariest part wasn't what had happened. It was that I didn't regret it. Not even a little. The next morning felt different. Not louder, not busier, just heavier. Like the house itself was holding its breath. I moved through the kitchen on autopilot, boiling water, slicing bread, spreading jam on toast I didn't intend to eat. I hadn't slept much. My body had rested, but my mind had kept running circles all night, tracing the contours of a moment that had ended before it even truly began. He came down the stairs while I was pouring hot water into my mug. The kettle clicked off as he stepped into the room, and we both paused as if waiting for something to fill the silence. He mumbled a quiet good morning, eyes cast downward. I replied just as softly, my voice nearly cracking under the weight of what we weren't saying. He sat at the table, scrolling through something on his phone, and I sat across from him, pretending to be engrossed in a magazine I had no intention of reading. Every rustle of the page, every sip of his tea, felt amplified. Neither of us dared to acknowledge what had happened the day before. Yet it hung between us, undeniable. I glanced at him from the corner of my eye. His face was still flushed, his posture tighter than usual, like he was holding himself in. He wasn't a boy anymore, not in the way he carried himself, not in the way he had looked at me through the steam. There had been confusion in his eyes, yes. But also a flicker of something else. Something I had recognized. Something I hadn't seen in far too long. After breakfast, I started to gather things for a trip to the grocery store. I told myself I needed to get out of the house. Breathe air that didn't belong to shared walls. I asked him if he wanted to come with me, half hoping he'd say no. But he didn't. He nodded, grabbed his keys, and followed me out the door. The drive was quiet at first. The radio played softly in the background, some old pop song I didn't recognize. He stared out the window, tapping his fingers against his knee. I focused on the road, even though my hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel. At the store, things felt oddly normal. We walked through the aisles, each of us pushing a small basket. He made a joke about the absurd price of cereal, and I laughed, too hard, too long. It felt good to laugh, even if it was awkward. We moved on to the produce section, and while I was examining a bunch of grapes, I felt his presence beside me. Close. Too close. His arm brushed mine as he reached for an apple, and my breath caught in my throat. He didn't pull away immediately. Just stayed there, his skin warm against mine. I turned to look at him, and for a moment, neither of us moved. His eyes searched mine, questioning, unsure. And then I looked away, breaking whatever fragile thread had just stretched between us. Back home, we unpacked the groceries in silence. Every time our hands touched the same item, I flinched. I couldn't help it. He noticed, of course. How could he not? At one point, he hesitated with a carton of milk, then handed it to me without meeting my gaze. Later that day, I found a note folded on the edge of the kitchen counter. My name wasn't written on it, but I knew it was for me. It simply said, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I didn't know what to do." That was it. No signature. No explanations. Just those words, scribbled hastily, like he'd been afraid to write them at all. I held the note in my hand for a long time. Read it over and over again. And then, for reasons I still don't fully understand, I smiled. Not because I found it amusing. But because it confirmed what I already felt, he was just as lost in this as I was. That evening, I changed clothes before dinner. Nothing dramatic, just a soft sweater that hugged me in places I usually tried to hide, a touch of mascara, a swipe of lip gloss. Nothing overt. But enough that I felt different. Braver, maybe. Or more exposed. I couldn't tell which. As we sat across from each other at the dinner table, I saw him notice. His eyes flicked up and down, quickly, like he was trying not to stare. He cleared his throat, asked if I needed help with the dishes. I said yes, even though I didn't. In the kitchen, we moved around each other with careful choreography. He rinsed, I dried. Our hands passed over plates and glasses like we were sharing secrets through porcelain. At one point, he accidentally bumped into me while reaching for a towel. His hand touched my waist, barely, gently. He apologized immediately, stepping back. I nodded, pretending it was nothing. But my skin burned where his fingers had been. We stood there in silence for a few moments. The faucet still running. The sound of water filling the sink, a soft, steady backdrop. He turned off the tap, looked at me. And then, without another word, we kissed, It was brief. Quiet. Not forceful. Not rushed. Just a moment suspended in time, like we were testing the edge of something neither of us fully understood. And then I pulled away. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. My hands were trembling, and I didn't trust my voice. I walked out of the kitchen and into the hallway, not looking back. I could hear him still standing there, not moving. Not following. Just waiting. I went to my room and closed the door gently behind me. Sat on the bed and stared at the floor for what felt like hours. My lips still tingled, my heart still raced. But more than that, my mind reeled. What had I done? I knew the answer, even if I didn't want to face it. A boundary had been crossed. Not in the bathroom. Not at the store. But here. In the kitchen. Between clean plates and borrowed glances. I told myself it was a mistake. That it wouldn't happen again. That I would fix it, somehow. But even as I made those promises, part of me didn't want them to be true. Because for the first time in a very long time, I had felt wanted. Not just seen, but wanted. And I didn't know what to do with that. The morning after the kiss was colder than usual, even though the temperature hadn't changed. I stood in the kitchen in my robe, clutching a cup of tea I had no intention of drinking. The steam drifted toward my face, but it didn't warm me. I stared at the faint ring on the table left by his glass from the night before, remembering how quiet everything had gone after I walked out. He hadn't followed. He hadn't knocked on my door. And yet, I'd barely slept. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind tapping against the window had stirred something inside me. I had pulled the blankets tight around me, as if to protect myself from something that had already happened. When I finally left my room and stepped into the hallway, I heard movement downstairs. He was up before me, which was rare. I hesitated on the steps, unsure whether I wanted to see him or if I just didn't want to pretend. My feet felt heavy as I made my way down. He was sitting on the edge of the couch, tying his shoes. When he saw me, he stood up, too quickly, as if he'd been caught doing something wrong. We exchanged an awkward glance, nothing more. He muttered something about going for a walk, grabbed his jacket, and left. The front door closed behind him with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the entire house. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the silence it left behind. Then I turned and went to the kitchen, trying to anchor myself in routine. I wiped down the counter even though it was already clean. Rearranged the fruit bowl. Opened the fridge, stared at its contents, and closed it again. Everything felt too loud, the humming of the refrigerator, the ticking of the wall clock, the sound of my own breathing. Later that morning, I sat on the back steps with a blanket around my shoulders and a notebook in my lap. I wasn't writing. I just needed something to hold, something to pretend I had control over. The garden was still damp from last night's rain. Tiny drops clung to the edges of leaves and sparkled in the sunlight. My thoughts wandered, not in a straight line but in loops. Why had I let that kiss happen? What did it mean? It hadn't felt like a calculated choice, more like something instinctive. A slip, perhaps, but not accidental. That's what frightened me the most. I had always prided myself on being stable, composed. I was the one who kept the house together, who smoothed over tension, who adapted when things got difficult. My husband leaned on that. Our life worked because I didn't ask for much, and he didn't give much. We had settled into a rhythm as safe, predictable, distant. But something in me had cracked open. Maybe it had been cracking for years, quietly, beneath the surface. Maybe the kiss hadn't broken anything but simply revealed what was already falling apart. By the time he returned, it was nearly noon. He stepped inside, eyes downcast, wiping his hands on his jeans. His cheeks were pink from the cold. I stood in the hallway, watching him set his keys on the table, noticing how deliberately he avoided looking at me. We moved around each other like dancers in a slow, awkward routine. I asked if he wanted something to eat. He nodded. I made sandwiches, poured juice. We sat at opposite ends of the table. He ate quickly, barely chewing. I only picked at my food. The silence between us wasn't angry. It was hesitant, uncertain. Like two people standing on the edge of a frozen lake, unsure whether the ice would hold. I cleared the dishes after lunch, and he disappeared upstairs. I spent the rest of the afternoon pretending to clean, though I barely touched anything. I kept replaying the moment in the kitchen. The way he'd looked at me. The softness in his expression, the way time had paused for both of us. It hadn't been impulsive, not really. There had been something building, something unsaid. That evening, I sat in the living room with the television on, the volume low. A sitcom played, laugh tracks echoing through the space, but I wasn't watching. I just didn't want the house to feel so quiet. He came downstairs eventually, hovered in the doorway for a moment, then walked past me and into the kitchen. I heard him pour water, shuffle around. A few minutes later, he returned and sat on the opposite side of the room, on the armchair near the window. We sat like that for a long time. Not speaking. Not looking. Just sharing space. The kind of silence that isn't empty, but full of everything unspoken. Eventually, he spoke. Just one sentence. "I'm sorry about yesterday." I turned to him, my heart pounding. "Don't be," I said. And that was the end of the conversation. We didn't dissect it. We didn't explain. We simply acknowledged it and left it suspended in the air between us. That night, I stood at the mirror in my bedroom, brushing my hair slowly, watching my reflection with a kind of detached curiosity. Who was this woman staring back at me? She looked older than she used to, yes, but also sharper somehow. More defined. As if the edges of her had come into focus. I climbed into bed and pulled the covers up to my chest. I didn't cry. I didn't even sigh. I just stared at the ceiling, letting the quiet fill me. At some point, I heard footsteps in the hallway. They stopped outside my door. A moment of stillness. And then, nothing. Just retreating steps, the creak of the stairs, the soft rustle of a door opening and closing. In that moment, I realized we were both afraid. Not of each other, but of what we didn't understand. Of what we might become. And yet, as I lay there in the dark, I also realized something else. The distance between us hadn't grown. It had narrowed. And that terrified me more than anything. The days that followed were a blur of almosts. Almost talking about it. Almost brushing hands again. Almost asking questions neither of us had the courage to answer. But mostly, it was avoidance. Soft, deliberate silence layered over everything like dust on an old photograph. Neither of us reached for a cloth. We just let it settle. He spent more time in his room. I spent more time pretending to be busy. I cleaned the same shelves twice, rearranged drawers, alphabetized spices I hadn't touched in months. I told myself it was about distraction, but I knew better. It was avoidance, plain and simple. The kind of avoidance that only works until it doesn't. My husband's absence had once felt like an inconvenience. Now it was a looming deadline. Each passing day a page torn from a calendar, one day closer to his return. And with it, the collapse of this delicate, unstable balance we'd created. One afternoon, I took a long walk. I didn't plan a route, I just wandered, letting my legs decide. I passed familiar streets, the park where we used to go when we first moved here, the bakery that used to sell the pastries he loved. At one point, I stopped in front of a storefront window, not because something had caught my eye, but because I saw myself in the glass. I barely recognized the woman looking back. She wasn't sad. Just paused. Like she'd forgotten who she used to be, or maybe she never knew in the first place. That evening, I suggested we go out for a change. A small museum downtown was hosting an exhibit, landscapes, mostly. Peaceful scenes, distant hills, oceans caught in soft oil strokes. I didn't expect him to say yes, but he did. And for a moment, something shifted between us, like a gate creaking open after too much rain. The car ride was quiet, but not tense. The kind of silence that was filled with anticipation instead of avoidance. At a red light, I glanced over. He was staring out the window, his jaw tight, his hands fidgeting with the zipper of his jacket. I wanted to say something, anything. But the words wouldn't come. The museum was dimly lit, with small spotlights drawing attention to the art. We moved slowly through the rooms, side by side but never too close. Every so often, we'd comment quietly about a painting, but most of the time, we didn't speak. I watched him from the corner of my eye. The way he leaned in slightly when reading the titles. The way his brow furrowed when something moved him. We stopped in front of a canvas depicting a stormy coast. Waves crashing against dark rocks, sky smeared with purple and gray. That one, I said quietly, feels honest. He looked at me, surprised by the comment, then back at the painting. Yeah, he said after a pause. It does. Afterward, we walked to a nearby cafe. It wasn't planned, it just happened. A shared glance, an unspoken agreement. The place was warm and quiet, filled with the soft hum of evening conversations and the clink of coffee cups. We sat by the window. He ordered tea, I ordered coffee, and we talked. Not about anything important. But it felt important anyway. He told me about his classes. His uncertainty about the future. I listened, really listened, in a way I hadn't with anyone in a long time. When it was my turn to speak, I hesitated. And then I told him about the bakery that used to be here before the cafe. About how I once spilled hot chocolate all over myself at this very window. We both laughed, genuinely. And then, for a brief, fleeting moment, we were just two people. Not tied by names or titles or guilt. Just two people in a quiet cafe, sharing something real. The walk back to the car was slower. Not because we were tired, but because neither of us wanted the evening to end. The streetlights cast long shadows on the sidewalk, and our steps echoed softly in the cool night air. At one point, our hands brushed. He didn't move away, and neither did I. But we didn't hold on, either. Just noted it. Back at home, we lingered in the kitchen. He offered to make tea. I didn't want tea, but I said yes. We moved around each other easily, like we had in the beginning, before everything became so heavy. When the tea was ready, we sat at the table again. He looked at me across the rim of his mug. I'm glad we went out, he said. Me too, I replied. We didn't talk much after that. He washed his cup, said goodnight, and went upstairs. I stayed behind, cleaning up even though there was nothing left to do. I stood by the sink for a long time, staring out the window at the dark yard. The garden was still damp. A single light flickered on the neighbor's porch. Something had shifted. I could feel it. We hadn't undone the tension between us, but we had given it a place to rest. Not resolved. Just acknowledged. Like the way a scar tells you something once hurt, but doesn't anymore. I went to bed later than usual. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt silent in the same way. There was a new kind of stillness, one that didn't suffocate. As I lay in bed, I let my thoughts drift. Not in panic, not in guilt. Just softly, like leaves carried by a stream. I knew this wasn't over. That something was still unraveling, inch by inch. But I also knew that what had happened tonight mattered. Not because it was extraordinary, but because it reminded me that something inside me was still alive. Something I hadn't felt in a very long time. The weather shifted the next morning, though I couldn't say whether it was the actual sky or just the weight in the air that had changed. There was something softer in the way the light came through the kitchen window, less sharp, less intrusive. I moved slower that day, not from fatigue, but from thought. Everything felt like it required more deliberation, making tea, folding the laundry, deciding what to wear. He came down late, his hair slightly messy, eyes still adjusting to the day. I was already at the table, my fingers wrapped around a warm mug, staring into the steam as though it could offer answers. He nodded a greeting, the kind we had exchanged countless times, and poured himself a glass of water before sitting across from me. The silence wasn't awkward anymore, but thoughtful, each of us living inside our own quiet. That morning I decided to do something different. I told him I had errands to run and asked if he'd come along. I didn't need the help, but I didn't want to go alone. He agreed without hesitation, and I felt a subtle tug in my chest, something between relief and anticipation. We stopped by the hardware store first, then the dry cleaners. Small, uneventful tasks that gave us something to do, a reason to move together through the world. We barely spoke during the car rides, but it wasn't uncomfortable. There's a kind of intimacy in silence that only grows when two people know exactly what they're avoiding. On the way home, rain began to fall, not in sheets, but lightly, like the sky had something it needed to let go of. By the time we pulled into the driveway, the windows were dotted with droplets, the soft sound of them tapping on the windshield like a slow ticking clock. We sat for a moment in the car, neither of us moving. Finally, I reached for the door handle, and we made our way inside. The house was dim from the gray outside, and the warmth inside felt heavier, denser somehow. I suggested we make something hot to drink, and he nodded, kicking off his shoes before following me to the kitchen. The kettle boiled while we stood side by side, and I caught his eyes more than once flicking in my direction. I didn't pretend not to notice, and I didn't look away when he met my gaze. There was no pretense between us anymore, just the fragile tension of understanding something had changed. We sat at the kitchen table again, this time closer than usual. The rain tapped gently on the windows. I spoke first, though I don't remember exactly what I said. Something about how quiet the neighborhood got in weather like this. He smiled faintly, responding with a small comment about how he liked the sound of rain. Our words didn't matter so much, it was the rhythm of them, the way they softened the silence rather than replaced it. At some point, I reached across the table to hand him a napkin. Our fingers brushed, and neither of us pulled back. We stayed that way for a second too long, just enough to feel the electricity return. Afterward, I stood to collect the empty mugs, needing to move, to interrupt the moment before it carried us too far. He stood as well, helping me rinse them in the sink, and the nearness of him behind me made my breath catch in my throat. I could feel the heat of him, the careful hesitation in his movements. He reached around me to place his cup on the drying rack, and for a moment, we stood too close. Neither of us moved. I turned slowly, unsure of what I was doing until it was already happening. Our faces were close, too close. His eyes searched mine with something between hope and restraint. And before either of us said anything, we kissed. It was soft. Almost careful. A moment caught in a pocket of suspended time. When we parted, it wasn't abrupt or clumsy, it was deliberate. We looked at each other, and I could see the question in his expression mirrored in my own heart. What now? I didn't answer him, and he didn't ask aloud. Instead, he stepped back, murmured something about needing to check his phone, and left the room. I stayed behind, staring at the spot where he had just stood, the air still warm from his presence. I moved through the rest of the day with an acute awareness of everything, of sounds, of space, of time. The house didn't feel the same. The walls hadn't changed, but something fundamental had shifted in the way they held us. Every footstep felt deliberate. Every glance carried weight. I went to my room earlier than usual that evening. Not to sleep, but to think. I sat at the edge of the bed for a long while, hands folded in my lap, heart pacing unevenly. I kept replaying it, what had happened, how it had felt, what it meant. I couldn't stop thinking about the stillness that followed. The way we both stepped away without a word, as if saying anything would make it too real. Later, I heard him moving around in the hallway, his footsteps pausing outside my door. My heart beat louder with every passing second. But he didn't knock. Didn't speak. After a while, the floor creaked softly again, and his door closed. Lying in the dark, I stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of my own emotions. There was guilt, yes. Of course. But there was also something else, something more complicated. A strange, quiet affirmation. Like a part of me that had been dormant for years had stirred. I thought about my husband, about the way he had stopped looking at me, the way he filled the space between us with his work, his travel, his silences. He hadn't been unkind. He hadn't mistreated me. But somewhere along the way, we had both stopped seeing each other. We had stopped reaching. That realization hurt more than anything. Because it meant I had let it happen. I had chosen peace over presence, quiet over confrontation. I had shrunk myself into the corners of our marriage, hoping not to disrupt what little structure we had left. Now, in the quiet aftermath of something forbidden, I was forced to confront the truth. I hadn't felt this alive in years. And that scared me more than anything else. Because now that I had remembered what it felt like to be wanted, to be touched gently, to be seen, I didn't know if I could go back. And yet, I wasn't ready to move forward either. So I stayed there, caught in the middle, in the shadow of a kiss I couldn't take back. Wondering if it had been a mistake, or something else entirely. The following day began in a strange kind of quiet, as if the house itself was waiting to see what we would do next. I went about my morning as I usually did, tea, toast, the scraping sound of butter on bread. But everything felt slightly askew, as though I were playing a part in a scene whose script I didn't entirely know. The kettle whistled, but I didn't move to turn it off until the sound became unbearable. He didn't come downstairs until nearly noon. I heard the creak of the steps long before I saw him. Each footfall was deliberate, careful, like he was measuring every choice. I stood at the counter, hands folded tightly in front of me, pretending to examine a spot on the backsplash that had been there for years. When he entered the kitchen, we didn't speak. He opened the fridge, poured himself a glass of juice, and leaned against the sink, looking out the window but not really seeing anything. I could feel the weight of his presence in the room, but I didn't turn around. I didn't trust my expression. Eventually, he left the room without a word, and I exhaled. I hadn't realized I'd been holding my breath. The rest of the day moved slowly. He retreated to his room, and I kept myself busy in every corner of the house. I washed sheets that didn't need washing, reorganized the hallway closet, cleaned out a drawer of tangled cords no one had used in years. I couldn't stop moving. Stillness felt dangerous, as if pausing for too long might force me to feel too much. Around mid-afternoon, my phone buzzed. It was my husband. A brief message, flight delayed again. Home tomorrow morning. I stared at the screen, rereading it over and over. One part of me had been waiting for this return like an anchor, something to ground me back into the familiar. But another part, the part one wasn't ready to admit even existed, felt an ache of something else. Not dread. Not guilt. just the sharp awareness that time was running out. I placed the phone face down on the table and walked to the living room. Rain had started again, light and rhythmic, tapping gently on the windows. The house dimmed with the clouds, and I turned on a lamp near the couch, letting its warm light spill across the room. I sat there, trying to read a magazine, but my eyes kept drifting, my thoughts unable to settle. At some point, I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't turn. I knew it was him. He walked slowly, stopping near the edge of the room. For a moment, I thought he might say something, but instead, he sat in the armchair across from me and looked out the window. We stayed that way for a while, two people sharing space, both weighed down by the same unspoken thing. Eventually, he said quietly, "It's almost over, isn't it?" I looked at him. His eyes were tired, but honest. There was no accusation, no desperation, just a simple truth hanging in the air. "Yes," I said. "It is." Neither of us needed to explain what we meant. His father, my husband, would be home in less than 24 hours. Whatever fragile, impossible thing had begun between us would have to end. It had always been temporary, always existed in the absence of someone else's presence. We both knew that. And yet, knowing didn't make it easier. That evening, we avoided each other. He stayed upstairs, I stayed down. I made dinner but didn't call him to eat. I picked at a plate of food and tossed most of it away, the trash can lid clattering louder than I intended. I stood at the sink again, staring out into the dark yard, rain still falling. I saw my reflection in the glass and barely recognized the expression on my face, part regret, part longing, part exhaustion. Later, after the house had gone still and the clock had crept past midnight, I stood in the hallway. I hadn't intended to. I had only meant to get a glass of water, but my feet had carried me further than I planned. His door was slightly ajar, the light from inside spilling out in a soft line. I froze, unsure what I wanted. A conversation? A goodbye? A moment of clarity that might make everything simpler? But before I could decide, the door creaked open wider. He stood there, shirt wrinkled, hair tousled, eyes filled with quiet conflict. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. I stepped back, my mouth slightly open as if to say something I couldn't form. He didn't move forward. He just watched me. And then I turned and walked away. Back in my room, I leaned against the closed door for a long time. My palms were flat against the wood, my forehead resting between them. My chest rose and fell in a rhythm that felt too shallow, like my lungs couldn't fill completely. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stood there, trying to return to myself. When I finally moved, I undressed slowly and changed into clean clothes. I brushed my hair, braided it loosely, and turned off the lamp. But I didn't get into bed. I sat on the edge, staring at my hands, at the fine lines that marked the passage of time. I traced the small scar near my thumb, the one I got from a broken teacup years ago. I remembered how my husband had wrapped my hand gently that day, how he had kissed my wrist afterward without saying a word. We used to be tender with each other. We used to notice. Somewhere along the line, we'd stopped. And that's what this was, I realized, not about desire or temptation or rebellion. It was about being noticed. About being seen, heard, touched, not just physically, but with intention. But intention has consequences. The morning would come quickly. My husband would walk through the door, bags in hand, smile on his face, expecting the same version of life he had left behind. He wouldn't notice the way the air felt different. He wouldn't ask about the silences. He would pick up his routine and expect me to fit back into it. And I would. I had to. But tonight, this last night, I sat alone in the dark and let myself feel what I had been too afraid to admit. I had crossed a line. And even if I never spoke of it again, even if nothing more ever happened, a part of me had shifted forever. And I would have to live with that. Quietly. Invisibly. Like so many things women carry. I woke to the low hum of tires on wet pavement outside, the sound oddly comforting in its familiarity. Morning light filtered in through the curtains, soft and pale. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe that everything was as it had been a month ago, before the kiss, before the late-night glances, before the air thickened between us with everything unspoken. But then the silence in the hallway reminded me. The weight in my chest reminded me. My husband was due home in a few hours. That truth had settled in my bones like a cold draft. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, fingers curled around the hem of my shirt. I wasn't sure what I was waiting for, maybe strength, maybe clarity. Neither came. Downstairs, I moved through the kitchen like a ghost. I made coffee I didn't drink, set out mugs neither of us used. I wiped down counters already clean. It was as if preparing the space might somehow prepare me, too. He came downstairs later than usual. I heard the hesitation in his steps before he entered the room. We exchanged a quiet glance, and then he went straight to the fridge, pulling out juice and drinking it from the bottle. I didn't scold him. What would be the point? I might go out for a bit, he said, not meeting my eyes. Okay, I replied. My voice sounded far away, like it belonged to someone else. He nodded and left the room. After he was gone, I stood by the window and watched the street. It was gray and still, the kind of weather that made the world feel slower, muffled. I thought about everything that had happened over the past 2 weeks, not just the moments, but the spaces between them. The long silences, the looks that lingered, the casual touches that felt anything but casual. And then the doorbell rang. I jumped slightly, heart leaping, but it wasn't him, it was a delivery. A package for my husband. I signed for it and placed it by the door, staring at the box like it might contain a clue for what I was supposed to do next. The hours passed slowly. I tried to distract myself, laundry, emails, cleaning out the hall closet, but my thoughts kept circling back to one simple fact: something would end today. Something quiet and complicated in mine. By the time the clock neared 5, the house felt too small. I needed air. I needed space. I stepped outside and walked to the end of the block. The chill caught me off guard, and I pulled my coat tighter around my body. The wind wasn't strong, but persistent, reminding me that change was coming, whether I was ready or not. When I returned home, the house felt different. He was in the living room, sitting on the couch, staring at the television screen though it was turned off. He didn't acknowledge me at first, and I wasn't sure if I should speak. But then he looked up, and I saw it, something quiet in his eyes. Not sorrow. Not guilt. Just a kind of gentle finality. He stood up slowly. "Do you want to talk?" he asked. I hesitated, then shook my head. "Not yet." He nodded. We moved through the evening in near silence. He made himself a sandwich. I poured tea. We sat at the table across from each other, but neither of us ate much. The weight between us wasn't tension anymore. It was understanding. After dinner, I cleaned the dishes while he stood nearby, drying them. Our hands moved in coordination, and for a moment, it almost felt like peace. But when he reached for the last plate, his hand brushed mine, and we both froze. There was no electricity this time. No thrill. Just quiet awareness. A knowing. Later that night, after the lamps had been dimmed and the hallway stilled, I heard him outside my door. He didn't knock. He didn't speak. But when I opened the door, he was there, standing with uncertainty written across his face. I looked at him for a long moment before stepping aside. We spent the night together. There is no other way to say it. There is no more to be told. It was quiet, simple, and filled with things we didn't have the words to say. We didn't speak much. We didn't need to. It wasn't about passion or rebellion or escape. It was about something else, acknowledgement, perhaps. Gratitude. Closure. In the morning, he was gone before I woke up. The bed beside me was still warm, the sheets creased in the shape of where he had been. I stared at the ceiling, heart heavy, but not broken. I rose slowly, pulling the covers back into place, smoothing out the lines. I dressed, combed my hair, and walked downstairs to make breakfast. The house was quiet again. The kind of quiet that settles after a storm, not because the damage is done, but because everything is holding its breath to see what's left standing. When the front door opened an hour later, it was my husband. He stepped inside with a bag in one hand and a smile on his face, ready to pick up where he'd left off. I stood there in the kitchen, holding a dish towel, and tried to match his smile. But I couldn't. Not really. Because even though nothing had changed on the outside, everything inside me had. The moment he stepped through the front door, it felt as if a carefully balanced structure had shifted ever so slightly. Not collapsed, just tilted, just enough to make the foundation beneath me tremble. My husband smiled, set down his bag, and exhaled the sigh of someone glad to be home. I nodded and offered a quiet welcome, unsure how else to greet him. The words felt formal in my mouth, like reciting lines from a play I didn't remember auditioning for. He commented on the weather, then asked about the house, about whether everything had gone smoothly in his absence. I responded simply, without embellishment, letting him fill the silence with his voice. I noticed how his presence filled the room again, the way he moved through the kitchen, claiming it again by habit. He opened cabinets, checked the fridge, scanned the counter for mail. It was the choreography of someone resuming his role without question, unaware that the script had changed. I made coffee. Not for myself, just for him. I remembered how he liked it. 2 sugars, a splash of cream. As I stirred it, I realized my hands weren't shaking. I thought they might, but no. I felt still. Not calm. Not peaceful. Just present. He sipped, complimented the flavor, and kissed my cheek absent-mindedly before heading upstairs to unpack. The kiss surprised me, not because it was affectionate, but because of how automatic it felt. As if he didn't see me at all, only the shape that waited in the same spot he had left it weeks ago. I remained in the kitchen, standing at the sink, staring out into the backyard. The trees swayed gently in the wind. The rain had left the soil dark and heavy. There was no sign of last night, no echo of what had passed between me and the boy who now stayed silent upstairs. He hadn't come down that morning. I didn't know if he was avoiding us both or giving me space. Perhaps both. Perhaps he didn't know what to say either. The hours moved strangely. My husband talked about his meetings, showed me photos of hotel lobbies and conference halls and people I didn't recognize. I listened with practiced interest, nodding at the right times, offering soft encouragements. I realized how good I'd become at this, being there without actually being there. By mid-afternoon, he suggested we go out for dinner. To celebrate being back, he said. I hesitated but agreed. I didn't want to raise questions I couldn't answer. He went to shower, and I found myself walking slowly toward the stairs. I paused outside the guest room, his room. I thought about knocking. I thought about speaking his name. But I didn't. I couldn't. I returned to my room instead, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the floor. When I finally stood, I changed into a dress I hadn't worn in a long time. It wasn't new. It wasn't flashy. but it fit in a way that made me feel like I hadn't disappeared. I looked in the mirror and adjusted the neckline, smoothed the skirt, tied my hair loosely. My reflection stared back, older than I remembered, but not lost. At the restaurant, we sat by the window. He ordered wine. I declined. He didn't notice. He talked about his flight, his coworkers, the bad coffee on the plane. I nodded, offered small smiles, played the part well. The food came. I picked at it. He ate with the appetite of someone at ease. I watched him closely, trying to remember the last time we had talked like this. Truly talked. I couldn't. On the way home, he drove. I stared out the window, watching the streetlights blur past in golden streaks. He reached for the radio and turned on the music, something from his playlist. I recognized the song, but the melody felt distant. It didn't belong here anymore. Back home, he yawned and announced he would go to bed early. He kissed my cheek again, this time even more softly, like a habit too old to feel anything. "It's good to be home," he said as he disappeared upstairs. I didn't follow right away. I walked slowly through the house, touching the back of chairs, the edges of picture frames, the curve of the banister. Everything was where it had always been. But nothing felt the same. In the hallway, I paused again outside the guest room door. It was shut. No light beneath it. I leaned in slightly, listening, though I wasn't sure what I hoped to hear. Silence? Sleep? Something else? I placed my palm gently against the door. Not knocking. Just feeling the cool wood. Then I turned and walked to my room. Inside, I undressed slowly, folding each layer of clothing with care. I placed them on the chair beside the bed, then changed into something soft, something loose. I brushed my hair again, out of habit more than necessity, and then sat on the edge of the bed. My hands rested in my lap, fingers intertwined. I thought about that night. The quiet of it. The honesty. The silence after, not heavy, but full. I thought about how he had looked at me, not with expectation, not with desire, but with something else. Understanding. The kind that doesn't ask questions. The kind that doesn't need answers. I hadn't expected that. I didn't expect it to stay with me the way it did. I lay back on the bed, pulling the blanket over me, letting the fabric settle around my shoulders. The ceiling above me was faintly shadowed by the lamplight, and I watched it like a screen. My thoughts played in flickers, fragments. Laughter in a cafe. Rain on glass. The brush of fingertips in the kitchen. The way it felt to be seen, without being judged. Without being needed. My eyes closed, and for a moment, I didn't feel shame. I didn't feel regret. I only felt the quiet. But I knew it wouldn't last. Tomorrow would come. Routines would resume. Conversations would pick up where they had left off. My husband would ask if I could pick up dry cleaning, if we needed groceries, if I'd seen the mail. I would nod, respond, fill the silence. And the boy upstairs would go back to being just that, a boy. A guest. A presence in the background. We would return to our lines. We would play our roles. But I would remember. Not because I wanted to. But because I couldn't not. Because something had shifted. And no matter how still the house became, I would always feel the difference. Like a hairline crack in glass, imperceptible to others, but once seen, never unseen. I closed my eyes tighter, pulling the blanket to my chin. And I waited for sleep to come. The next morning began the way mornings often do, quietly, without drama or suddenness. My husband was already in the kitchen by the time I made it downstairs. He was reading the newspaper on his tablet, a half-eaten piece of toast resting on a napkin beside him. The radio played softly in the background, some old tune from decades ago that used to mean something to us. Or maybe it didn't. I couldn't remember. He greeted me with a smile and asked if I wanted coffee. I nodded. The routine was intact. Familiar. Practiced. He rose, poured the coffee into a mug, added just the right amount of cream, and handed it to me with the ease of someone who had done it 100 times before. A small act of care, but I felt strangely distant from it. We chatted about nothing. The weather. An article he had read. Some neighborhood construction project that might delay traffic. I played my part, smiling when appropriate, nodding in all the right places. But inside, my thoughts drifted constantly, like they were pacing behind a closed door. He asked if I wanted to go for a walk later. I told him I might, depending on how much work I had to catch up on. He accepted the answer without question, already distracted by a notification on his screen. Upstairs, the guest room door remained closed. I hadn't seen him that morning, and I didn't expect to. I imagined he was doing what I was, focusing on the ordinary, hoping that the repetition of routine would somehow erase what had happened, or at least smooth its edges. I spent the next few hours cleaning the bedroom. Not because it needed it, but because I needed something to do with my hands. I reorganized the closet, rearranged folded towels, dusted surfaces that were already spotless. I moved with mechanical precision, trying to force a sense of control over a life that had slipped from its neat boundaries. While putting away some photo albums from the top shelf, I found an old birthday card tucked between two books. It was from my husband years ago, when we were still writing to each other in cursive, still leaving notes hidden in drawers, still calling just to hear the other's voice. His words were simple, affectionate, familiar. I read them slowly, then folded the card back into its envelope and placed it where I had found it. Downstairs, I heard the front door open and close. My husband calling that he was going out for a jog. I answered without moving from my place. His footsteps faded, and the silence returned. This time, it didn't feel comforting. It felt expectant. I stood at the window for a while, watching the leaves sway in the breeze. The garden looked almost the same as it had weeks ago, but I didn't. I felt older somehow, not in years, but in weight. As though I had carried something too far for too long, and only now realized how tired I'd become. I didn't know what I was waiting for until I heard soft footsteps behind me. I turned slowly, already knowing who it was. He stood in the doorway, hesitant, his hands tucked into the sleeves of his sweater. He looked younger today, somehow. Or maybe just more uncertain. Our eyes met for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. Neither of us spoke. Finally, I gestured toward the living room. He followed, sitting at the far end of the couch while I lowered myself into the armchair. We sat in silence, surrounded by the quiet hum of the house. I opened my mouth once, then closed it again. I didn't know where to begin. "It's okay," he said finally, his voice low. "You don't have to say anything." But I did. I just didn't know what the right words were. "I keep thinking about it," I said, more to myself than to him. "Not just what happened. But everything." He nodded. "Me too." The simplicity of his response startled me. No justification, no demands. Just honesty. "I don't know what it meant," I admitted. "I don't know what it still means." "I don't either." It wasn't a confession. It was a release. I looked down at my hands, folded tightly in my lap. "He doesn't know." "I know," he said. There was no judgment in his voice. Just understanding. And then came the hardest part. The part one hadn't prepared for. "I don't want to pretend," I whispered. "But I don't know how to go on without pretending." He looked at me then, his eyes steady. You don't have to explain. I think we both knew it couldn't last. His words were kind. Too kind, almost. I nodded, biting down on the urge to apologize for everything and nothing at once. I'll leave soon, he added. I think it's time. A breath I hadn't realized I was holding escaped my lungs. I didn't argue. He was right. Later that day, I found myself in the attic, looking through boxes I hadn't touched in years. Childhood toys, vacation souvenirs, mismatched candlesticks. Things we kept not for use, but for memory. I wasn't sure what I hoped to find. Maybe a version of myself I had forgotten. I spent nearly an hour there, sifting through the past. When I came back downstairs, the house felt different. Not quieter. Just more final. My husband returned from his jog and asked if I wanted lunch. I said I wasn't hungry. He shrugged, said he'd make a sandwich. I watched him spread mustard across the bread like he always did, methodically, as if nothing had changed. And in some ways, nothing had. But in others, everything had. That evening, I sat outside on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the sun dip low over the trees. The air was cool, the sky streaked with fading light. The weight in my chest didn't feel quite as heavy anymore, but it hadn't left either. It had simply shifted, settled into a place I could carry it from. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But I knew it would come, with or without permission. And I would meet it. Changed. Quietly. But still standing. It was raining again the next morning, a slow and steady drizzle that blurred the windows and muffled the sound of passing cars. I woke before anyone else and lay in bed for a long time, listening to the soft rhythm of drops against the glass. There was something peaceful about it, something final. As if the world was quietly washing away the remnants of something that had already slipped into the past. I rose without turning on the lights, moved through the house as though trying not to disturb its stillness. My feet padded softly along the hardwood floors, and every creak of the boards felt strangely comforting. Familiar. The kitchen was cold. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and brewed a cup of tea, watching the water swirl in the mug. I didn't add sugar this time. I wasn't sure why. He came downstairs an hour later, suitcase in hand. His jacket was folded neatly over his arm, and he wore the same quiet expression he'd had the night before when we said nothing but understood everything. We stood in the kitchen, a few feet apart, neither of us reaching to close the space. I'm going to head out early, he said, voice steady. Traffic might get worse. I nodded, unsure if he expected me to say anything more. I left a note, he added after a pause. I felt my throat tighten. Okay. He hesitated, then walked to the front door. I didn't follow. I heard the door open, the shuffle of bags, the soft click as it closed again. No slam. No drama. Just an ending disguised as departure. I stayed in the kitchen for a long time. The tea had gone cold in my hands. I stared out the window at the wet street, now empty again, and let the silence settle back into its usual place. Not heavy. Just present. Eventually, I found the note on the dining table. Folded once, my name written neatly on the front. I opened it carefully, as though the paper might tear under the weight of its meaning. There were only a few lines. Thank you for seeing me. For letting me see you. I won't forget. Be well. That was it. No apologies. No confessions. Just honesty. I folded the note and placed it in the drawer next to the notepads and pens. Not to keep it hidden, but to give it a resting place. Something that had existed, that mattered, but didn't need to be explained. By mid-morning, my husband had begun his usual Saturday routine, checking emails, folding laundry, asking about dinner plans. He didn't mention the boy's absence. I wasn't sure if he even noticed the timing, or if he simply assumed things had returned to normal. I didn't correct him. The day passed slowly. I cleaned the kitchen again, then dusted the hallway pictures, one by one. Each frame held a frozen version of us, smiling, holding hands, surrounded by celebrations and travel. I looked at them longer than usual, searching for signs of who we used to be. I found familiarity, but not recognition. In the afternoon, I stepped outside for air. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained heavy with clouds. I walked slowly along the garden path, past the flower beds that had begun to wilt in the cold. The soil was dark and soft beneath my shoes. The wind stirred my hair, and I didn't reach to fix it. There was a quietness inside me now, not empty, but measured. Like a room that had been cleared of clutter and finally had space to breathe. I didn't feel relief, exactly. But I didn't feel lost either. That night, while my husband dozed on the couch in front of the television, I sat at the dining table with a notebook. Not to write about what had happened, at least not directly, but to remember how it had made me feel. Not just the moments of closeness, but the clarity. The way silence between two people can feel more truthful than any spoken words. I wrote about the kitchen light at dusk. About shared glances in hallways. About the way time felt slower when you noticed every detail of someone's presence. I wrote until the page was filled, then closed the notebook and placed it on the shelf between two recipe books. Upstairs, I took my time getting ready for bed. I washed my face, brushed my teeth, changed into soft cotton pajamas. I moved without urgency, without distraction. I turned down the bed, opened the window slightly to let in the cool air, and sat on the edge of the mattress. The room was quiet except for the distant hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the settling house. I folded my hands in my lap and stared into the dark. Nothing dramatic had happened today. No confrontation. No unraveling. Just life, resuming in its usual form. But something had changed. Not outside. Not in the rhythm of the house. But in me. I had stepped across a line I could not uncross. But I hadn't run from it. I hadn't denied it. I had lived through it, felt its weight, and now carried it forward, not as shame, not even as regret, but as truth. There are things we do not because we want to destroy, but because we long to feel. And sometimes, what we feel cannot live in the life we've built. It asks to be known in the space between. In the silence. In the glance. In the almost. And when it ends, it leaves not a wound, but a seam. A line where something once was. A place you can touch, but never quite explain. I lay back and pulled the covers over me. The sheets were cool against my skin. I closed my eyes and listened to the night sounds, soft, distant, familiar. Tomorrow would come. The same as always. But I would meet it with a quiet I had earned. One that no one else would hear. But I would carry it. And I would remember.